We want to go now to the head of FEMA, Brock Long, who is at the agency's headquarters in Washington. Good morning, Administrator Long. Let's start with a statistic I've been thinking about all week. The number of people who die from wind is down around 8%. This is from the Associated Press. But storm surge, flooding, that's almost 50%. Is that the big concern with this storm?
Well, initially, when a hurricane makes landfall, particularly one that has major, what we call major category winds, category 3, 4, or 5 winds, storm surge has the highest potential to create the most amount of damage, but unfortunately, it also has the potential to cause the most loss of life. So one of the storms I want to point out is Katrina. 270 people lost their lives in Mississippi because the ocean rose well over 25 feet in some areas, and anybody that didn't evacuate from that doesn't live to talk about their experience from storm surge.
And so is that concern now?
Initially, Florence, it's a different storm than Katrina. Obviously, we didn't have a Cat 5 landfall in Florence, but what happens is you saw a lot of damage. You see a lot of people being rescued from storm surge on the coastal islands, the west side of the Pamlico Sound, but now it's turning into a flood event. And the flood event, people fail to heed warnings and get out, or they get into the flood waters trying to escape their home, and that's where you start to see deaths escalate. So wind, even though hurricanes are categorized by wind, it's the water that really causes the most loss of life.
What about the interruption of medical care from these kinds of events? We reported over 700,000 are without electricity. What about the interruption of medical care? How dangerous is that?
So what we always do is work with our partners over at HHS, and we forward deploy disaster medical assistance teams. There's hundreds of people out into the field, and not only to support the medical needs, but also we are ready to support any evacuation transportation needs.
The interruption of medical care that you were just talking about was responsible, I believe, for 47% of the fatalities in Katrina, and is a big part of that number that's been disputed this week about Puerto Rico, the 3,000 number. So the president said that 3,000 number didn't exist, that they didn't die. So how is it true that you're preparing for interruption of medical care in Florence, but the president says people who died as a result of interruption of medical care in Puerto Rico are not worth counting? Look, these studies are all over the place. The Harvard study was done differently, studies a different period of time versus the George Washington study. There's a big discrepancy, whether it's direct deaths or indirect deaths. If you look at the root cause of any problem is one, around here, one death. These guys know one death is a death too many. We work every day to make sure that we try to prevent that. But if you want to get into Puerto Rico from the standpoint of what needs to happen next, you got to fix aging infrastructure that wasn't ready to support, the Commonwealth before the storm hit. And when they were blown out and the infrastructure's blown out, it exponentially causes problems on the back end. But the reason this is so important, obviously, is if you figure out how people died last time, you can keep it from happening again. You say the numbers are all over the place, but the numbers are more than zero, which is what the president said. He said the deaths didn't happen. I guess my question is this. The GW report, as you mentioned, again, the bulk was from interruption of medical care, which you're trying to take care of in Florence. They interviewed people from FEMA to come up with that number. So who's right, the president who says those deaths didn't happen, or the FEMA officials who helped GW put together that report?
Yeah, I don't know who they interviewed within my agency. They may have looked at funeral benefits to help, calculate whatever number, and that's a number, that's the only number that we would really be able to contribute to any study going forward. But
let me ask you this. Puerto Rico might get hit again during hurricane season. People who worry about dying from interruption of medical care, which is the bulk of those deaths that get to the 3,000 number, is FEMA concerned about people who might die from that result in Puerto Rico?
What we do is we coordinate the firepower of the federal government down. So, for example, FEMA doesn't rebuild power grids. We basically pay for it and help to coordinate the resources they need. And that's the same case that would be within the health and medical industry. And, my authority to support rebuilding the power, if you get the power back up, that solves 95% of the problems. Bottom line is we push forward on that authority as much as we can. And Puerto Rico is a very vulnerable place right now, but we're focused on putting billions of dollars of work to prevent this and build it more resilient so that it doesn't happen again.
Let me ask you a final question. The Wall Street Journal had some reporting about you and your status. It suggested that because of your use of travel, that there was an Inspector General's report and that
Department of Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen went to you and discussed whether you should continue in your job. What's your response about that?
Yeah, so that narrative is, yes, there's an ongoing investigation. We've been working with the OIG, very clearly, and I can come back and put context around that. But in regards to Secretary Nielsen, I've never been asked to resign. Secretary Nielsen and I talk every day. We have a very professional, functional relationship. We are both focused on Floyd right now. And, let's put some context on what the vehicles are that they're talking about. So this job is incredibly complex. On my shoulders is Presidential Preparedness Directive 40, which means, I have to make sure, FEMA has to make sure that the executive branch of government works on its worst day at any given time, regardless of what we see. And a lot of that is continuity of government. Those vehicles are to supply me with secure comms. The program was developed in 2008, way before I even got here. It ran for me the same way that it ran for anybody before me. And we comply every day. We'll make meaningful changes. I would never intentionally violate any rules, that I was there aware of. So.
All right, Administrator Long, thanks so much for being with us, and good luck with that long to-do list.
Thank you.